everyone, it's Cass. Welcome back to my channel, What Cass Read. Today we're going to do a video that I have been wanting to film for a long time. Super excited to bring this up on my channel. And that is some fantasy books for beginner fantasy readers. My recommendations for beginners to the fantasy genre. I'm focusing these book picks based on people who want to transition from reading YA into fantasy or just new people into the genre in general. My fantasy reading journey started off with The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit series. And you'll notice that I haven't included those books in here because I feel like in the plethora of fantasy books that we get in the bookstore now, there's just so many choices that you don't have to feel like you have to start with the classic fantasies. Like, you could build up to classic fantasy instead of just jumping right into the deep end, which is what I feel like I did. I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings when I was like 14 because as a younger reader 15 years ago, the YA section was non-existent. Now readers definitely have more choice when it comes to their fantasy books. So a lot of these picks are going to be really traditional fantasy based, but one of the best trilogies that I think is a good starting point for fantasy readers is going to be the Riyria Revelations series written by Michael J. Sullivan. I do have a whole video on how to read Michael J. Sullivan already on my channel, so I can go ahead and link that for you. Book 1 is Theft of Swords, book number 2 is called Rise of Empire, and book number 3 is called Heir of Novron. So I like this book series because I called it fantasy light when I first read it. It was really action-packed, it was really fast-paced, and as someone who is transitioning from a YA book series into this series, I think the pacing is still going to be the same for you. I think you're still going to hit all the right beats, all the right comedic timing. There's a little bit of romance, but there's a lot of friendship involved in this story, sword fighting and magic, and just it's got all the tropes that you expect in a fantasy series, but it's just a really good time. So that's why I like to recommend this series to beginner fantasy readers. This is the Inheritance cycle written by Christopher Paolini. So that includes book number 1, which is called Aragon. Book number 2 is called Eldest. Book number 3 is called Brissinger. And the 4th and final book is called Inheritance. I like recommending new fantasy readers to Aragon because it is actually published in the YA section. So it's a familiar sight for some of you probably, but I think when this book starts off, it starts off sounding like a YA story, but then it morphs into so much more. There is a lot of the fantasy tropes that you find where there's a young boy is the chosen one. He finds a dragon egg in the forest, and dragons are thought to be extinct, but the dragon has hatched, and they, set off on an adventure to learn magic and save the world. The author was 15 when he wrote this story, so when you read this first one, you're gonna notice his growth as a writer as he moves on. But I like introducing people to this series before branching off into the more adult fantasy genres, especially if you like high fantasy, especially if you like epic fantasy, because this is told in multiple person perspective. There's elves, dwarves, dragons, magic. There's different languages for each of them, and so the world is really, really intricate. And I think if you can make it through this series, then you're gonna be set for any high fantasy series that you encounter. Okay, this next series is the Faithful and the Fallen series, and I'm currently in the middle of this one, but I feel like this is a really good stepping stone for a lot of readers of fantasy as well. The first book is called Malice, the second book is called Valor, the third book is called Ruin, and the fourth book is called Wrath. This is another high fantasy series, and I know that not all fantasy relates to high fantasy, but I think this is a good transitional book for readers of young adult into high fantasy, especially if you like Game of Thrones. If you've seen Game of Thrones on HBO, on TV, and you really like that story, but you've seen the books and you're like, I don't want to read those books, I don't think I could pay attention to all the storylines, but you like that kind of story, then I believe that the Faithful and the Fallen series could be a good series for you to pick up. We follow a lot of different characters once again, and this takes place in the Banished Lands where giants used to rule the land. There was some cataclysmic event and there was a god war that banished the giants from the world, and men came into power. We follow a young chosen one again. We get a really sassy sister character who just wants to be a fighter. We get magical creatures, and there's a lot of political maneuvering and some dark magic involved. And so this one I think is a really good introductory series, because while they look thick, the chapters are really short and it moves really quickly. I think it has just the right amount of like battle sequences that you can get really excited about, but not as gratuitous as Game of Thrones, or might be a little too gory. But I feel like as I was reading this book, I could see all the pieces on the chessboard moving, and then when whoever is controlling this chessboard, they pull the string and it brings all the pieces together, and then the action is just nonstop after another, after another, after another. So I've only read the first 2 books of this series, but I just had a really good time with it. It's not as dense as Game of Thrones, to be honest. That's what I'm drawing the most comparisons to. So I really have been having a good time with the Faithful and the Fallen series, so I'd like to recommend that to you. This next book that I have to mention, this is The Name of the Wind, written by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the story about Kvothe. We find him as an older man, and there's a chronicler who has sought him out and wants to write his life story. So we have 2 differing timelines of Kote telling his story about Kvothe, and then Kvothe's life as he grows up with a really tragic childhood, as he grows up in this university and learns how to use magic, then as he ventures forth from the university. And the way that the story is told, I feel like, is something completely new to the genre. So if you like the sword and sorcery, but you're a little bit over some of the stuff that I mentioned before, because all of those are kind of in the same vein, then I would really recommend The Name of the Wind for you, because it is just vastly different in terms of how the story is told. So I think give this a try if you want something a little bit different than the other 3 book series that I've just mentioned. So this book, this is The City of Brass, written by S.A. Chakraborty. I actually do have a full spoiler-free and spoiler review of this book already on my channel. I read this earlier in the year because it was nominated for the BookTube SFF Awards. I'd like to recommend this book for beginning fantasy readers, because I feel like this is a book that's firmly in that new adult category, but really written well and has good character development. It has really cool magic, and it's something different than the traditional high fantasy that I've just been showing you. So this follows a young woman named Nari, and she grew up in 18th century Cairo as a con woman on the streets, and she's trying to con people out of money because she wants to go to medical school. And she gets involved in this con where she's accidentally summoned a magical warrior, and then she gets embroiled in the world of the jinn. It's a new fantasy setting that we don't really get a lot of, this Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, African mix of cultures. And I think for anyone who is a young adult reader, this could be a really easy transition for you, because I felt this one was a little bit more new adult. So it's like right in that sweet spot between the young readers and the adult readers. And the second book comes out very, very soon. So if you decide to start on The City of Brass, and then you're watching this in January, you can pick out the new book if you ended up liking it. The ending was great, the characters were great, the magic was cool setting, so I recommend The City of Brass, written by S.A. Chakraborty. And then you had to know, if you followed my channel for some time at all, that I would mention any sort of Robin Hobb. So this is the Liveship Traders trilogy, written by Robin Hobb. It's a part of her gigantic Realm of the Elderlings. I've made a whole video on this whole trilogy and her entire series if you want to check those out. But the series includes book number 1, Ship of Magic. Book number 2 is called Mad Ship, and book number 3 is called Ship of Destiny. So this book might be the most dense out of all the books that I've recommended today. But I think that you should definitely give this book a shot. Not only is it my favorite trilogy, but it has all the action, all the family that you could want, really interesting magic, and it's got pirates in it. I haven't found many fantasy series that can do pirates right. Like, a lot of them include pirates, but these are some of the best pirates that I've ever encountered. I used to hate pirate books, by the way. Hate them. This series turned me around. This book follows the Bestrip family. They are a family of traders in the city of Bingtown, and they have what is called a live ship. A live ship is made out of this mysterious material called wizard wood, and when 3 successful generations of the family's captain have passed away on the ship decks, then the ship becomes infused with their memories and comes to life and can interact with them, can talk. So this book had pirates, it had dragons, it had sea serpents, it had talking magic ships. And I think if you really want to jump headfirst into some bigger fantasy epics, this is a really great really great introduction to that. This book series, like I said, is an entire gigantic 16 book series, but if you don't want to get bogged down in 16 books, this trilogy out of all of them is the one trilogy that I think could be read as a standalone, and you'd be perfectly fine just reading this trilogy. Content warning as you get to the end of this trilogy. There is some graphic descriptions of like a medical surgery and then graphic scenes of sexual violence. I say this because I don't want anyone going into the series saying, oh, she recommended this to me, but she didn't tell me. So if that's something that's like a big no for you, then check out any of the other books that I just mentioned, because they don't have those types of scenes in there. But if it is something that you can read, then I think this book series also tackled the topic of sexual violence better than any other fantasy book that I've encountered, because it addresses the perspective of the survivor, and that's just not something that we really encounter either. So that's something that I did want to let you know if you were going to pick this series up. But again, if that's not something that you like to read in your fantasy, then any of the other series will be just fine. That wraps up some of my recommendations for beginners to the fantasy genre. If you have any questions about any of these books, please let me know. Reach out to me in the comment section below, or you can also list some of your recommendations for beginning fantasy readers down in the comment section below as well, and I'd love to hear them and love to see maybe if I've read them or not, or if I still have yet to get to them. Otherwise, you can also follow me on my social media if you like to use Twitter and Instagram. I'm at WhatCassRead, so it's super easy to find. And then there's also my Goodreads account. That's always going to be linked down below. Otherwise, you know how these videos end. I'll talk to you later. Bye.